you. And in the next couple of days, you will receive a link to the recording as well as any links that will be mentioned during today's webinar. So don't worry too much about noting things down. Everything will be emailed to you. And as you will have seen, today's webinar is about using annotation in multilingual classrooms. Our speaker, Tom Beeks, who's a trainer for the Bell Foundation, will explore practical techniques and strategies to support EAL learners across primary and secondary in text-based subjects. During the webinar, feel free to use the chat to ask any questions as they come to you. I will collect them and then I will pass them on to Tom at the end of the webinar. And with that, I'll hand over to Tom to take us through today's topic. So over to you, Tom.
Thank you very much, Shaka. And yeah, hello and welcome to everyone. And yeah, it's such a pleasure to see people joining us from all over the place. So, from Nairobi to Dubai to Mongolia to Altrincham. I mean, there's not too many webinars where you get such a geographical spread. So that's lovely to see. And please do add comments or questions in the chat as we move along, and I will do my best to try and address those as we come along. And also feel free to share your own, experiences and ideas as well, because I know we have a lot of experience, I'm sure, in looking at the different roles and the different contexts people are joining us from. So here's our outline for this webinar. And we're going to, at the beginning, just take a broader look at the kind of reasons why we use annotation when we're working with text, and particularly why these might be helpful for our plurilingual learners of English. We will be looking as well at some different practical examples that will support our learners both with developing their content and language knowledge as they're learning. And we're also going to look specifically at methods to promote independent learning, and also how we can bring in home languages of our learners and use those to support their learning. And overall, hopefully that will give you some ideas for supporting your plurilingual learners when you're working with texts. And we will be focusing at different stages and different language proficiencies as well. So the things and strategies we'll be talking about here can apply across school stages. I think one of the beautiful things about annotating texts is that it is actually a really flexible and very broad-ranging set of techniques that we can use with different age groups and different language proficiencies. And hopefully that will allow our plurilingual learners of English to better access and learn from the kinds of curricular texts that they encounter while they are learning with us. So we'll start off by just identifying what we're talking about when we are saying and using this term annotation, and then thinking about how that might be useful. And I think the most simple way I can explain it is that annotating a text is writing on or marking on the text in some way in order to help us better understand or engage with the text. But given the range of experience we've got attending this webinar, I would like to start by getting your ideas. So when you hear the phrase annotation or annotating texts, could you just share what examples of tasks or techniques that you think might be described as annotating? These could be things that you use with your own learners or that you use yourself to help you when you're studying or learning or in your professional life. If you don't have any, that's fine, but I'm curious to see what people have to share. And when you add in the chat, as also, please, if you want everybody to see it, make sure that the blue button above the chat box is set to everyone and not just to hosts and panelists. Otherwise, only me and Shaka will see it. Nobody else gets to see it. Yes, Andrea, nice example. Yeah. Breaking down words, color coding. So I'm looking off to my second screen here while I'm reading these comments. And drawing pictures, explaining words, simplifying words. Okay, annotating with key vocabulary, synonyms, summaries, questions, images and symbols, synonyms, diagrams, vocab, student notes, student agency. That's a good phrase and something we'll be looking at later in the webinar. Yeah, lots of people mentioning highlighting. Oh, annotating in home language. Yeah, if you have the writing skills. Okay, so yeah, that's a wonderful range of responses we've got there. I almost feel like I don't need to do the rest of the webinar, to be honest. But I think what we've just seen from these responses is that on the face of it, right, annotation seems like a very sort of simple and almost mundane classroom activity. But when we start thinking about it a bit more deeply, we can see that it really encompasses a lot of distinct learning behaviors. And again, I'll throw in some examples. I think these have probably already been mentioned, but just to illustrate, uh, that a learner could, for example, circle unknown or new words in a text. They could underline particular types of words or parts of speech, to use a sort of English language term. And 10 bonus grammar points if you can spot the connection of the words that I've underlined on the screen there. A learner could also add translations, as has been mentioned, in their home language. And that can help them remember the meaning of new words, or also clarify the meaning of words. And I think, as we can see here, this isn't always as straightforward as it might seem when we're translating. And I've given an example there of the word squirrels translated into Spanish. That's pretty straightforward. It's very concrete. It's an animal, translates quite simply. And there's another translation there for the word grandfather. And in Chinese, that presents a bit of a problem because there are multiple ways of translating that word into Chinese because they have different words depending on whether it's a maternal or paternal grandfather, for example, or depending on the level of formality, it might be a different word. So there's 3 or 4 different ways they could translate that word. And so, of course, you know, for a learner, that might lead to a translation, but it also might lead to them asking a question, as in, you know, which of these words would be best to use. So adding questions is another key technique that learners can use. They could ask questions about the text. So an example here, asking about the punctuation used in the text. Or they could also just write comments about the text to show their feelings about it. And they could be comments, they could be symbols, or they could be, I guess, emojis. Or, of course, you could highlight a section of the text that is important in some way that you want to be able to remember, to be able to come back to it later, for example. So we can see that there's a lot of variety and richness potentially going on here. And before we look at some specific examples, which we are going to do, I think it's really useful to categorize these different types of annotation and their different uses according to their purpose and how they are helping our learners, because it's going to help us clarify in our minds and use these techniques more intentionally when supporting our learners. So if we think of the examples we've just described and that you guys have provided in the chat, we can categorize each of these different techniques in terms of the reasons or the function. It would be the linguistic term, or discourse function if you want to be super academic. So one function of annotating text is identifying. So that might include finding answers, noticing certain grammatical structures or vocabulary types, such as, you know, underlining all the adjectives or all the past tense verbs or all the fronted adverbials. if you're unfortunate enough to have to teach that type of thing. And this can be really helpful in raising awareness of grammar conventions and broadening vocabulary for our English language learners. Another key function is building meaning. So that might include techniques like translating, paraphrasing or summarizing, linking to other ideas, adding different modalities, so images or audio or other text to the existing text. And this aspect is obviously particularly critical for our multilingual learners who've got that double job of developing their language alongside developing their content knowledge and their curricular knowledge, often at the same time within the same lesson. Another function is what I've called interrogating, but I mean, basically, this is the asking questions aspect. So we can use annotations to clarify understanding. We can ask about an idea or a concept that's confusing in terms of the content, the curricular content, but we could also ask about language aspects or meaning as well from a linguistic perspective. They could ask, why a writer chose to use certain language or made certain choices about how the text is structured. And they could also add opinions or commentary about what they like or don't like about the text, or what is or isn't effective, depending on how you're analyzing the text and what your learning outcomes are for the particular subject area you're working in. And the last, I think, technique, the last function that was referred to is this idea of prompting, I would call it, which encompasses things like reminding us of key areas of the text, cueing other actions, so, bookmarking it for later. So I need to make sure that I, add this to my essay later on, or highlighting a word to look up or a term to research later, or a study to explore in more detail, or whatever it might be, as if we're talking about more academic texts. So, as I mentioned, we'll get into more practical examples as we move along to illustrate each of these areas. But I just wanted to highlight that annotation is, this very rich and productive range of techniques that can facilitate learning for all our learners, regardless of their language or language proficiency. But obviously, we're going to focus particularly today on how it can help our plurilingual learners of English to better access the curriculum, and how we can scaffold these annotation techniques, especially for these learners. So in particular reference to our multilingual learners, like why are these useful? And what are the principles behind using these techniques and the outcomes that we hope to achieve? And I think there's plenty of reasons we can talk about. And one is that it provides interaction. So it's helping our learners interact more meaningfully with the text. And it's a way of working in a text in a more active way. And we know that when it comes to language learning, interaction's more effective than passive exposure. So, when we titled Making Texts Talk, yeah, it sounds very nice, but this is what we're getting at, is this idea of interacting with a text and having more than a one-way sort of passive experience of a text. And this is going to help build on those passive reading skills to help learners retain information and develop language at the same time. And linked to that is that annotation is a way of modeling effective reading strategies. It's a bit like how we teach children to read out loud before they do it in their head silently. So by getting them to annotate a text in a way that replicates what in future may just become mental processes, but initially we're getting them to write it down physically on a page, we're training them in those strategies, and we're scaffolding that process. Or we might want to model annotation techniques that we want them to continue using independently as study strategies or self-study strategies. So things like note making, And this modeling, again, will be useful for all our learners, but for our language learners, there might be particular types of modeling that are more beneficial. So, scanning for new and or familiar vocabulary and making choices about what to pay attention to within a text and what is less important. And a really important function of annotation for our language learners is that it's going to make texts appear less intimidating and reduce that cognitive overload and stress, which we know is extremely inimical to good learning. So a lot of these techniques really boil down to reducing that cognitive overload. And tied to this is that annotation is a really great way to bring in learners' home languages to enhance their learning. So that might be by allowing them to express ideas that they wouldn't be able to express otherwise, or by helping them make connections between their own language and English, or just by providing translations to help smooth and deepen that understanding, especially when they're at the earlier stages of language acquisition, because we are ultimately all we're doing is reducing that cognitive overload that comes with that dual burden for our plurilingual learners. And annotation will support review, revision, and retention of content as well if it's done judiciously and we train our learners how to do it in a way that works for them and is meaningful for them. So obviously this will be true for all learners regardless of English proficiency or language background, but it's likely to be particularly important for our plurilingual pupils, especially those of them that are arriving into an English medium school later in their school career, perhaps, where they really need to get up to speed quickly, and perhaps they have lots of the knowledge and the cognitive skills in their home language, but they may still be developing those in English, but who probably have to sit some kind of high stakes exam or assessment in English in a few years' time. And so I think as a revision tool, it can be very powerful. And again, directly related to that is that annotation, I think, is a really powerful way of developing study skills. It's popular at the moment, isn't it, to talk about metacognition or learning how to learn, but however you want to describe it, a lot of annotation techniques fall into this category. And it's most obviously relevant to our older learners and in secondary, who are going to be expected to work increasingly independently. But it's crucial and entirely possible to start introducing a lot of these ideas with our younger learners as well, as we'll see, and kind of scaffold those and get them used to working with texts in this way from a young age. Okay, so that's our sort of theory and rationale, and I deliberately spent a bit of time on that because I do think it's really important to clarify why we are doing things so that when we introduce the practical stuff, it's immediately clear why these things are going to be helpful. So here's a list of activities, and we're going to start broadly with, I guess, activities for learners at the lower stage of English proficiency, and perhaps work our way towards strategies that we might use with learners as their proficiency and confidence with working with English increases. And we'll start off by looking at visuals, okay? It's a staple of EAL support, isn't it? It's a really important strategy in all kinds of different contexts, and annotation is no different. And this is a particularly helpful technique for new to English learners, especially where they are new to literacy altogether. So, for example, we might provide a word mat or illustrated flashcards with the pictures and the words attached to them, clearly kind of referencing their meaning directly. And simply learners could use those visuals to find the corresponding words within the text. Apologies for the blurry text there, because we're not allowed to use copyrighted examples of textbooks within the presentation, but it gives you a schematic idea of what we're talking about, because the actual text itself is not important. So even if they aren't able to read or process the full text yet, we can start getting them used to identifying keywords, and it's training them in those basic text scanning skills, which is something that they need to be able to rely on as they start working with texts in more depth and detail. And of course, we could also do this the other way around of allowing learners to annotate with pictures themselves. So again, with our younger learners, this is going to work best with very concrete and easily drawable, easily annotatable concepts. So, I mean, things like color words, shapes spring to mind, perhaps even emotions, where they can draw little emojis, and then they can annotate the text with a picture, again, to sort of get them used to identifying language within a text and also reinforcing that meaning for them, especially if they're at the level where they're not yet comfortable or secure writing, whether in their own language or in English. Another technique is scanning the key words. Again, obviously, this is a really core reading skill, but let me give you another scenario. So imagine we've got a group of upper primary learners who are studying life in Roman times, and they're looking at texts about how ordinary Romans lived, and each group is looking at a different focus. And then together in their groups, they'll summarize what they think about their topic, and then they're going to put that on some kind of shared spidergram on the board or a display in the classroom, so that there's a whole class display at the end of the lesson. And let's imagine we've got two new to English learners, and they're working together in the group that's talking about clothing. And to support those learners, we might give those children a list of vocabulary, clothing vocabulary with illustrations, so it's very clear what each word is referring to. And then they simply have to scan the text and identify the words. But imagining these learners are a little bit older and have some literacy in their home language, they could write a translation next to it in their home language, which they could also include on the spidergram summary that they are creating with their classmates. And the teacher can encourage and praise the use of all the languages alongside English on the final diagram. It's sort of very simple, but it's a sort of step beyond what we were looking at in the previous activity. Another task is identifying answers to questions. And all these kind of identifying activities revolve around highlighting answers to questions or prompts within a text. And they usually involve highlighting longer chunks of language beyond individual words. So again, this is more appropriate for learners who are a little bit further along at earlier acquisition or developing confidence stages of language learning, where we want to start getting them more skilled at getting meaning out of longer chunks of text. So a simple way of doing that, for example, would be a matching sentence halves activity. So you could find 3 or 4 sentences that you think are really important from the text and put them in half, cut them in half, and mix them up. So here's a text about the day in the life of the Roman child and 3 sentences, and the learner matches half A with half B. And you could provide these sentences before they view the text, and then all they have to do is identify the final finished sentence from within the text. So that acts also as a way of them checking their answers to see if they're correct as well. So it's a very sort of simple activity, but if you look, we could also use it from a linguistic perspective to focus on some key language features as well. So here I've highlighted the connecting words that appear in the second half of the sentences. So, but these linkers that are really critical, and so that could be used as a way of also focusing our learners on key bits of language that they're going to encounter. Another technique is a simple true or false activity. So again, this is really common, isn't it, certainly in English language teaching texts, where you'll have a written text, and then below it are a series of statements, and the student simply has to say if they're true or false. So here's an example taken from this text, and the learners would read the statements, read the text, and then choose whether they are true or false. And then importantly, annotate on the text where they found that answer. So that again, there's that direct linking to the text. And we are also as a teacher, allows you to understand if they're actually understanding what they're reading. And a version of this, it's a little bit more sophisticated. So again, we might use this with learners who are a little bit older and learners with higher language proficiency, is to do this, but with causes and effects. So this particular text doesn't necessarily lend itself really well to this activity. So these examples are quite simplistic, but certainly once we're working with texts in, for example, humanities or science, where there's a lot of talking about cause and effect happening, this can be very affected. So, you might give a list of causes, such as homes were crowded, and then the learner looks at the text and fills in what the effect of that might be, and then identifies that within the text. Where do they find that information? So again, a very sort of simplistic example in this, but it's actually potentially a very cognitively demanding task, this. And I just wanted to draw your attention to the fact that these tasks are a great way to focus our multilingual learners on key information to reinforce it. And it can also help teachers check understanding of a text and focus our learners on important structures as well. It could do all of those things together, or you could just be focusing on one of those things, depending on what your learning outcomes are and what the needs for learners are. And I just wanted as well to point out that these tasks mentioned increase in the cognitive demand required. So we go from matching the sentence halves, which is less cognitively and linguistically demanding, because there's no linguistic production required from the learner for that task. It's just passive, to the cause and effect task, where there's quite a significant amount of, they have to write some notes down, and then they also have to think about this cause and effect thing, which is quite sophisticated thinking. So again, this sort of shows how we might sort of scaffold these kind of activities as our learners progress through their school careers. And one thing that we do with our older learners, especially once we get into upper secondary upper primary and into secondary school, is we start to look at different genres of writing. So annotation is a great way of raising awareness of different genre features. We can imagine, for example, a group of learners are looking at a magazine or website aimed at teenagers, aimed at children the same age as the students. And you could ask them to work in groups to identify examples of informal language. That might include things like contractions, can't, won't, don't, but also things like wanna or gonna, which you sometimes see written down in informal context as well. Colloquialisms and slang, idiomatic language, and personal pronouns. So simple words like I and you are more common in informal language texts because they're speaking directly to the reader than in more formal contexts usually. And the interesting thing about this is it lends itself well to working with mixed groups, mixed proficiency groups, because with learners at earlier stages of language acquisition, you might want to ask them to focus on and identify things like contractions and the pronouns, because they're much more easily identifiable within a text than those other features, which are a bit more abstract and require a much greater knowledge of language to identify. And of course, we could do something similar for formal language. And again, I'm choosing informal and formal language as an example here in particular, because it's a critical skill for learners to be able to distinguish as they progress in their school career between these different genre types of language, or these different levels of formality. And yeah, we have features like sentence linkers there. And I think the synonym task is a useful one where you might, for example, look at a text and identify some quite formal language in there that could have much simpler synonyms. So, then you can write them a simple task that says, okay, within this task, can you find, two more formal ways to say the word put or do or write? And obviously, depending on the text and depending on the subject, those words can be adapted and changed. And it could be used with any kind of text, whether that's a letter, formal letter, like a job application, or an academic essay, or it's very flexible. Okay. So moving on to the use of questions. And again, this would normally be a strategy we would introduce as part of independent learning with older learners once they're we're expecting them to be able to operate independently when they're working with texts. So let's just give an example of a year 10 IGCSE science class, and students are individually reading a text about aerobic and anaerobic exercise, for example, and so they can apply it to their PE lesson as well. And a band C learner, for example, so they're probably understanding most of the text, but there might be specific bits of vocabulary on some of the more complex bits of language that they might be struggling with, could be finding that they're struggling with some of this more complex language. So they could write notes to themselves in the form of questions, which the learner could then research later in a home language. And then could follow up by clarifying with the teacher or with perhaps their EAL specialist if it's a language question. And this, of course, could happen informally, or it could be part of a routine where the learner is meeting with a EAL specialist during particular periods or particular sessions during the school timetable. And a further scaffold we might add here is to provide prompts as well for those questions, because it's all very well saying ask questions, but as we know, when you ask a bunch of children to ask a question without any scaffolding, you tend to get blank stares, and it's no different if we're expecting them to annotate. So we can give them prompts to help them with that. And there's some examples. Okay, so I've been battering you with loads of ideas, and I've got one more to show you. And this isn't really a strategy or a technique on its own, but it's the final example. I want to demonstrate how you might use many of these techniques together, and also to show that annotation doesn't have to be restricted to purely a reading or writing activity. So in this scenario, imagine we've got a year 11 class examining the text of a poem from a previous English literature paper as part of their exam practice. And the teacher has asked them for their homework to make notes on the poem on various poetic devices, including rhyme and rhythm. And so again, this will be a task for higher proficiency learners typically, but let's imagine we've got a band D learner. They might use a text reader. So that's a piece of software that reads the text to them while they're reading, so they can listen to it. And of course, that's going to help them identify things like rhyme or rhythm. This learner can also identify and highlight examples of things like alliteration or assonance or metaphor and simile. And you can use annotations such as question marks if they're not sure, so that they can seek clarification from the teacher in the lesson. And the learner might also write translations next to some of the unfamiliar words or some questions around the theme of the poem. And as an additional thing for this homework, the teachers also shared a link to an actor performing the poem. And so this means that the learner also have access to video footage of the poem. And again, I think for our multilingual learners, this is potentially really powerful because getting to see somebody using the language in that more authentic way is really going to help them tune into things like the pronunciation and the intonation, probably in a more or useful way than a text reader, which can sound quite robotic sometimes. So this learner, again, wonders of modern technology, they could use their own smartphone to take a video of this performance, just videoing it off the screen. And most videos, most phone cameras these days have very simple and quite easy video editing software. So we've always think about annotation as being a written activity, but actually increasingly, there's no reason you can't annotate a video. And there's also no reason you can't annotate using verbal prompts or using voice notes, for example. And there are various pieces of software that do that. Again, not all students will want to engage with text in that way, but for some, it might. And you can imagine for topics like English literature or drama, where that might actually be really useful. So, the student can annotate also on the video, and maybe they can add written translations, for example, to certain sections, or they could add their own questions, or they could highlight pronunciation of things that they want to practice later. There's all kinds of possible options. And later in class, the group could come together and they all discuss their annotations to the poem. And the teacher creates a shared online document copy of the poem and gets the different groups of students to add their annotations to it. And within each group, the students are responsible for commenting on a different aspect of the poem. So they all have a different focus to look at. And so this is also a way of showing that annotation, we think of it as being an individual activity, but there's no reason it can't be a group activity as well. And again, this can be scaffolded by providing different roles for learners within the group. So one person might be focusing on summarizing or paraphrasing. Somebody might be responsible for identifying different linguistic techniques that the class have been focusing on, and so on. So and we could also, by distinguishing these roles and being more concrete, we are going to scaffold their ability to do that more independently as they get more confident and they get older. Okay, which leads us nicely into this idea of developing independent learning, which I wanted to kind of keep to its separate section, despite the fact we've already discussed quite a few ways that we might support that. And when we think about developing independent learning, we can, I think, identify two possible approaches, or at least two possible ends to the spectrum of annotation when it comes to working independently. And so at one end, we have a more prescriptive approach. So that would be a more teacher-guided approach. And we've given some examples already of where the teacher gives very specific and bounded instructions for what they want the students to annotate. So, identify 4 different verbs for reporting speech, or underline which sentence tells you the character is feeling unhappy, very specific. The purpose here is pre-decided by the teacher, and this tends to be used with those identifying type of tasks that we've talked about. Perhaps the downside of this approach is that it doesn't necessarily lead to independent use of these techniques. So I was reading a blog, which I'll link to later, about using these techniques in the classroom, and the teacher was pointing out that when she used these more prescriptive approaches with the learners, they worked really well within the lesson, within the task, to achieve the goals, but they didn't lead to the students using those techniques on their own later in other lessons and in other classes and other contexts. And so at the other extreme, we might want a more responsive approach to annotation. So that's where it's coming from the learner, it's learner-led, it's more flexible. The purpose is the reasons for doing the annotation are chosen by the learner in response to their own particular needs for that particular task or subject. Therefore, there's a broader range of choices if we think about all the different types of annotation we've just talked about. And the idea here is that this responsive approach is going to lead to much more independent use because the decision making is coming from the learner. It's going to lead to more experimentation, and it's going to lead to learners figuring out what works for them, which again may look different significantly from learner to learner. So I guess as educators, then we kind of need to think about how we're going to bridge that gap between that sort of prescriptive approach and the responsive approach to annotation. And I'm not saying that one is better than the other, that I think they both have a place, right? But we do need to ensure that learners have opportunities to develop their own techniques and strategies. So that's what we're going to look at in the next few slides. And I divided these up into ideas that the learners can do and ideas that teachers can employ. So for our learners' perspective, a really, I think, really important skill for our multilingual learners is getting them into the habit of creating their own glossaries, their own word lists or language lists. And part of that is going to involve having an annotation system to highlight the words or phrases that they want to remember, and then being able to use translation tools independently to create a glossary at home as a study tool. I think it's a really powerful skill that our plurilingual learners need to develop. Now, of course, when they're younger, this is going to need to be scaffolded. So I guess we can imagine at sort of secondary level, especially sort of once they get sort of 14, 15, young adults, they can do this we can expect them to do this sort of thing independently. But with our younger learners, we have to scaffold this. So it might be that this is something that happens within the lesson, at least at first, and or within their, or something that they do with their EAL teacher in collaboration or with the TA to support them to do it. Aligned to this would be for them to create their own keys and their own systems. So here's a very simple example, but if they like highlighting things in different colors, then maybe they could use yellow means new words that they're going to look up later. Blue is, I'm not really sure about what this section of the text is talking about. I need to look it up later. Green might be, oh, this is something I need to ask the teacher about because I need an explanation, and I don't think it's something I can work out on my own. This is just one example. Of course, it could be, from an EAL perspective, it could be a lot more language focused. So, they have a spiky line to highlight adjectives in a poem or a story, curvy line to indicate adverbials, whatever system that they think will be useful to help them with the task that they're doing. And of course, we can provide them with these kind of systems to begin with, and then they can start to create their own as they get more confident and independent as learners. And lastly, they could make notes specifically to share with a teacher or staff member that they will be meeting with again later. So this might work, for example, with home language annotations if the staff member shares their same home language. That's where our multilingual teaching staff really can be very helpful. Or it could be in English. But the idea here is that, they are annotating with a specific purpose in mind, which is they are going to be meeting with a teacher later. And so it makes it a lot, you're likely to get much more specific and concrete and useful responses when they know that it's somebody else is going to be looking at those annotations and working through them with them. So again, the key is helping learners develop their own systems that work for them and the context in which they're learning. So from a teacher's point of view, then, well, what are we doing? So learners can get on with those techniques. And as a teacher, I think there's a few really simple but important things we can do. And one of these is providing templates. And simply, this is one reason for this is it addresses the logistical challenge of annotation, which is, you need space to write in a text. You can't necessarily write on a textbook because, maybe it belongs to the school or it's, only temporary or there's no space. And for our younger learners who maybe can't write in tiny handwriting yet in small margins, then giving them a template like this is going to scaffold their ability to make annotations. And I found this one and adapted it from a free template that I found online. So if you Google the article "Art of Annotation," the blog by an educator called Andrea Castellano, she's got some brilliant ideas in there. They're all aimed at learners in general, learning in general, not necessarily English language learners, but there's some great ideas in that article if you want to look in more detail. And again, what's great about these templates is that the prompts and headings that you can use where you can adapt depending on the type of text you want and what you want the learners to do with it and what we want them to be able to learn. I can see somebody saying you can't see the content. You're not missing anything terribly. Important. At the top, it says there's a column that says title, type of text, and who will read it. So that's talking about the audience. And then on the right, there's two boxes. One is a box for new words and translations, and the box below says my ideas, and it has a couple of prompts. And those prompts, I think, would be the things that you want to adapt and change according to the task. And at the very bottom, the box there says one sentence summary. So the idea is that the learner writes a kind of summary as much as they can in a sentence, to paraphrase. But actually, the details are less important here than the idea of having a sort of basically a structure for them to work with. And we can then reduce that scaffolding towards something that's less scaffolded. And of course, not all texts are just a page. This isn't going to work in every context, but the idea is that we are, if you want students to annotate, we need to give them the physical ability to do that. Another thing to support this is the use of clear rubrics. And so this is where we would give them a rubric showing exactly the type of things that we want them to look for while they're annotating. So again, it's another example I got adapted from the blog I just referenced by Andrea Castellano. And again, she split this into two categories: key language and ideas. So what is the author saying? And the other category is craft and structure. How is the author saying it? And obviously these categories are appropriate for a kind of English language class or an English literature class, but they could be adapted and changed for different subjects. The other important thing about rubrics is they can be translated. So we can, using whatever tools you have or other access to multilingual colleagues, you could translate these, and that's quite powerful because the more clarity and depth of understanding learners have when you're setting these kinds of tasks, the better the quality of response you're going to get. As soon as it starts getting vague and hazy, you start getting kind of woolly, hazy annotations, and that's not very useful. And these rubrics also allow learners to potentially devise their own preferred methods of annotation. It's almost like a menu for them to choose from. And obviously, again, as they get more independent, that's something those decisions are things they need to be able to make for themselves. This is a really simple one, but it's just teaching them how to use dictionaries. And it may seem obvious, but in an increasingly technological world, we may have to teach our learners how to use a dictionary in English if we're expecting them to look up words and translate and things like that. This is especially true if the learner's home language is one that doesn't use the Roman alphabet. So, things like Chinese or Korean or Japanese. And there's a nice summary of what that looks like in Peter Clement's and Adri Slapak's book from last year, which I'd highly recommend. It's very practical. It's called Supporting EAL Learners. Loads of great practical ideas. And they mentioned that the things you should be doing are teaching the basics. So tell the learners that the words are placed in alphabetical order and what that means. Teach them about the format and the structure. There's guide words at the top of the page. The main words are in bold. They will have parts of speech and they will have different abbreviations, noun for noun, verb, adjective, and so on. You need to model what it looks like to look up a word in a dictionary. Take some key vocab from your lesson and talk through how you would find it. You could show them using a visualizer if you have one, or just, sitting with them with a dictionary. And give them lots of practice and opportunities to look up words. And this lends itself to a lot of quite fun activities as well. Who can find what page of the dictionary that these keywords can be found, and who can do that the fastest. And you can do like little dictionary races and games and challenges and things. And actually, kids usually respond really well to it. And sort of linked to this, we talk about dictionaries, but increasingly we're reliant on online tools for translation, aren't we? And that's becoming even more so with the advent of all these AI large language models, as they're known, which can do translation as one of their functions. So we really need to provide guidance to our learners on what it looks like to use these translation tools effectively. So that means, warning them of the pitfalls of online translation. So, for example, translating individual words is often very problematic. We should always try and translate a word in context of a sentence. Otherwise, it could easily misunderstand the meaning, because words often have multiple meanings. So, table and chair has a different meaning to the table in their exercise book that they have to fill in. And it's only by providing some context that an online translator will be able to choose the right translation. It's also, especially again with the advent of these AI tools, figuring out which translation tools are most reliable for different languages. So again, we need to take particular care for speakers of less widely spoken language, because generally speaking, with these AI large language models, they translate best when they have more data to train on. And another thing that some of the research I've looked at suggests that, a bit like humans, these AI translation tools are better at translating from other languages into English than from English into other languages. And so there are little things like this which we might want to think about and make our learners aware of. So a couple of minutes. I'm not going to go into lots of depth on this topic of exploiting home languages, because actually you'll have noticed that we've picked up on lots of different examples and ways we can do this when we were talking about these activities. But I did want to think about a few considerations when we are using our home languages with annotation. And the first of those is to try and normalize as much as possible the visibility and presence of other languages in your classroom as much as possible. I know a lot of international schools now are really getting really good at doing this, but it's really important to just, get students used to seeing other languages written on a page, and not just the students, but the teachers and the teaching staff. Because if you're in a really monolingual context, or you were trained or grew up in a monolingual context like I did here in England, it's just not something that it's a bit unfamiliar, and it's a bit scary sometimes. And actually, if you have learners who come from that context, it's really important just to make it kind of feel normal and comfortable, and make those contributions feel valued as well. As I've mentioned, it's really important to provide that accessibility and clarity. So, using home languages isn't just about celebrating multilingualism and all that kind of thing. It's about helping them learn, and it's a tool for learning. And a big part of that is reducing that cognitive load. So can we translate rubrics and templates? Can we translate key content when needed, especially for our learners who are new to English? and then obviously reduce that scaffolding perhaps as they get more proficient. And it links to this thing of providing access to translation tools when appropriate. Obviously, there aren't not for every task or activity, but unless there's a really good reason for not providing access, then I think we need to, learners should have access to these things. Otherwise, it's a barrier to learning. And then this links into this idea of being intentional about how we use our home languages. It's like anything else, it's a tool for learning, it's a tool for reducing cognitive load and for allowing students to express themselves. So we need to plan when it's appropriate to bring in home language use and when it may not be. So specifying the language that you want learners to use, for example, when they're doing annotation is really important. Tell them, okay, you need to do this. You need to do this in English, or you need to do this in your home language, or you can choose which one you prefer, depending on what the task would be. So again, my guide rule would be, is using English providing an unnecessary cognitive load? And what is the main purpose of this task? Sometimes there needs to be a compromise. Sometimes it's fairly clear what the right approach is. Okay, so just to end, I'll very briefly summarize some of the things we've talked about with some of the general tips. Yeah, it's a really interesting point I've seen in the chat about translation tools and how it can be a distraction. But yeah, I think it's absolutely not necessarily something that I'm not advocating for giving free access, I think, to translation tools to all students, because obviously there are pitfalls to that. But in summary, model, always model our annotation and model our thought processes as well. So talking through the reason why we're doing these annotations, because most of the time annotating is basically it's externalizing what's happening inside our minds, isn't it? And it's making it concrete. Use those templates we talked about. Share examples. And so those of you who are lucky enough to have visualizers in your lessons where there's cameras that show what students are doing, they're perfect for this. Share examples of successful uses of annotation from other students and examples that have been produced by learners. That's a great way of learning. And again, we think of annotation as being an individual activity, but it doesn't have to be. It could definitely be collaborative, especially if we have, new to English learners and you have speakers of the same language, of their same home language in the class. They can work together with each other to complete these kind of tasks. And as we've mentioned, using home languages as a tool, as a resource is going to really help our multilingual learners access their learning. So to finish, any questions? And I think we've really almost run out of time, actually. So I'll hand over to you, Sharka, and thank you everyone for your participation and for the comments.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tom. I couldn't see any questions apart from a couple of people asking for a link to the template, which I think we can include in the email that we'll send with the webinar recording.
Yes, we can, yeah.
Yeah, but other than that, thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Before we go, I just wanted to make you aware of our upcoming events. We will be running our next webinar in March, and they will involve guest speakers, practitioners from international schools who will speak about building partnerships with parents and carers. So if that topic is of interest to you, do keep an eye out or join our mailing list to know when the bookings open. And bookings are already open for our online courses between now and the summer. You can see the upcoming courses on the slide there. So we've got courses aimed at senior leaders, EL coordinators, but also practitioners. Got the Assessing Proficiency course running in February, for example, and then the Adaptive Teaching course starting on the 12th of May. So if you want to find out any more about these courses or would like to book, do go to our website again to find out more information. And just a reminder that we will send out a recording of this webinar with all the relevant links and resources within 48 hours. So thank you very much for joining us today, and hopefully see you again soon.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.